and welcome to In Pursuit of Truth and Happiness, Episode 2, The Iliad and Historical Interpretation, Part 2. Previously, I gave a general overview of the relationship between the Iliad and historical interpretation, in as far as Homer presents to us an understanding of the cycle of war that dominates the unfolding of history right down to the present day. I also discussed the first principle arguments of Homer that speak to how Homer understands the fortunes of war and how the argument of divinity's intervention in war may not be as superstitious as it first may appear. Today's episode will pick up where I left off by completing an analysis of the last piece of the puzzle of what causes the cycle of war to recur throughout history. Not from the perspective of divinity reaching down to earth, mind you, but from the human level attempting to reach out to the divine. The opening of the Iliad is fundamental to understanding what Homer has to say on the philosophical foundation of war. Quote, "Rage, goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, but made their bodies carrion, feasts for the dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was moving toward its end." End quote. There is quite a bit to unpack from this opening, but I will focus instead here on the concept of rage as this relates to war as a philosophical concept. And by philosophical, I mean the human reaching to the divine. Firstly, we should make note that the rage of Achilles is what sets up the entire story of the Iliad and kickstarts the tragic series of events that leads to Hector's death and the subsequent fall of Troy, the latter being beyond the scope of the book. An in-depth analysis of Achilles will be made in a separate episode that will contrast Achilles with Hector. Suffice it to say, what is said of Achilles, in as far as concerns his rage, how a certain attitude toward the merit of virtue and suffering for virtue, the overall lack of temperance, reinforcing a lack of faith in suffering for the sake of virtue itself, that pushes Achilles to seek the transcendence of his own being in any varying degree of form of the transcendence of his own being in whatever way this may look on his own terms in response to the natural human desire of the transcendent, that is the desire for the transcendent, for example, is our desire for truth, can be applied to many in history, even our own time, who espouse these same first principles of Achilles. This manner of interpretation can be done in other literature pieces in the same way, such as applying the circumstances and suffering of Job from the book of Job in the Old Testament to all those just souls that suffer in history and the present. What will be drawn out here is a general analysis of where Achilles' rage comes from and how this particular mindset of Achilles that can be pushed to others pushes mankind into war. What should be first noted is a simple lack of temperance on the part of Achilles. When Achilles rages, there seems to be no quelling the rage. Achilles will rage on and pray for the deaths of his comrades and enemies. Achilles will fight scores of Trojans on account of his rage. Achilles will fight a river, a point I will return to later, on account of his rage. Achilles will kill Hector and drag his body around the grave of Patroclus over and over again on account of his rage. And in the midst of these raging episodes, there seems to be an attempt by Achilles to see something greater, thus precluding any simple lack of temperance on the part of Achilles to satisfy his rage. This deeper analysis of Achilles is glimpsed at the end of the Iliad when Achilles is met by King Priam to claim the body of Hector. At one point, Achilles says the following, quote, So the immortals spun our lives, that we wretched men, live on to bear such torments. The gods live free of sorrows. There are two great jars that stand on the floor of Zeus's halls and hold his gifts. Our miseries one, the other blessings. When Zeus, who loves the lightning, mixes gifts for a man, now he meets with misfortune, now good times in turn. When Zeus dispenses gifts from the jar of sorrows only, he makes a man an outcast. Brutal, ravenous hunger drives him down the fate of the shining earth, stalking far and wide, cursed by gods and men. End quote from Book 24. Achilles reveals his understanding of the problem of human suffering and how this relates to divinity. This understanding of evil in relation to Zeus retains some similarities to how Job understood God before God's revelation of himself. Cross reference Job 2 at the end of the book of Job, with the notable, obvious different actions that Achilles takes in contrast to those of Job, but arising as they do from the shared lack of understanding as to why distant deities either permit or hurl sufferings to humanity without a clear justification. Another proposition to take away from this quote that reveals the first principle of Achilles is Achilles' understanding of free will. Achilles' attitude towards human suffering, that Achilles further understands as coming from Zeus, is further underscored by what Achilles explicates as the human response to the suffering that comes from on high. If it is true that mankind is turned into an outcast, driven by ravenous hunger in an existence that is cursed by gods and men, is there any room, or rather any point, for virtue, such as the virtue of temperance? Is there any merit in suffering for virtue? Is humanity doomed to live out its existence as a curse, or perhaps not, depending upon the arbitrary decisions of Zeus, whose own free will in the face of the concept of fate is also in doubt? Is the only available option to merely give assent to this doomed fate? If so, there seems to be nothing better to be found in this life, or even in the next. There seems to be no reason to have faith in the transcendent, except in what mankind itself can seize or create on its own through its own tools. How better can humanity sees what divinity seems to deny to mankind than by using violence to seemingly make oneself godlike, or to become, in essence, a force of nature, in a deliberate rejection of the inherent limitations of human nature and in pursuant of that state of bliss the gods seem to enjoy. Achilles demonstrates this when he does not hesitate to charge the river god Scamander in Book 21. A futile attempt, to be sure, and even comical when an image is pictured of a man charging at a deathless god or thrusting his spear at a river god. This scene of Achilles charging the river, although, offers more than just entertainment. It is tempting to see war as nothing more than a scorekeeping game, where one side wins simply because it was, better equipped logistically or tactically. But this only offers a mechanical overview of war and ignores that constant human feature that unites all wars throughout history. What changes is only the magnitude of war and the technology used. What never changes is the human use in privation of force to seek apotheosis on its own terms, an action born from the first principle understanding that the only happiness to be found in this world is what we can create or seize for ourselves. Yet this very thinking, be it cynical or realistic, no matter how you understand it, does objectively lead to the suffering of the innocent, as Andromache, the widow of Hector, foretold at Hector's funeral. The Trojan War echoes across history, and in the pages of history and eyewitnesses to all wars throughout time. As the Great Ideas of the Western World, Volume 2 states, quote, Herodotus apotheosizes the movements of the Persian horde. Thucydides, the rise of Athenian naval power. End quote. Perhaps not true divinity, but a close enough apotheotic attempt to become more than what our limitations allow us to be, forgetting, even for a moment, that we are, after all, only human. Thank you for listening to this episode of In Pursuit of Truth and Happiness. The next episode will explore the characters of Hector and Achilles.